October 1944. Within the immense, merciless arena of the Pacific, an imperial power was in its death throes. The sun symbol, which had formerly burned bright over a shocking stretch of sea and soil, was now trembling, deprived of resources, metal, and optimism. For 3 years, the Japanese Empire had conducted a conflict of breathtaking aspirations. However, the repercussions of those aspirations were now surrounding them like a burial cloth. The industrial sector of America, a slumbering behemoth stirred into a colossus of manufacturing, was commissioning vessels more rapidly than Japan could destroy them, and instructing aviators quicker than Japan could eliminate them. The strategy of island hopping, an unceasing procession of metal and flame, had delivered Allied troops to the immediate threshold of Japan's inner perimeter. The supply route was on the verge of being severed. Originating in the Dutch East Indies oil reserves, the dark lifeblood of Japan's military apparatus pumped northward. This current of propellant was the only thing keeping its surviving battleships, cruisers, and airplanes functioning. At this moment, General Douglas MacArthur, undertaking a maneuver of massive tactical and representational significance, was getting ready to disembark his troops on Leyte Island in the Philippines. If he were to triumph, the conduit would be cut permanently. To the Imperial High Command located in Tokyo, this represented more than just another engagement. It stood as their ultimate resistance. Confronted with the option of a gradual, inevitable suffocation or a magnificent, conclusive clash against insurmountable probabilities, they selected the latter option. They decided to wager everything that was left on a single monumental throw of the dice. A strategy so intricate, so bold, and so hopeless, it was assigned a plain, nearly reverent title: Shogo 1, or Operation Victory. Yet, how does one secure a win when the only thing remaining is the bravery to perish? The scheme was a work of art in tactical deception, conceived from the ruins of Japan's aircraft carrier force. Following the massive Marianas Turkey Shoot during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the naval air strength of Japan was merely a ghost of its previous stature. Consequently, the handful of surviving carriers, possessing scarcely any skilled pilots or aircraft, were to be utilized as sacrificial decoys. Displayed in front of the belligerent Admiral William Bull Halsey, this northern group was intended to entice his potent Third Fleet away from the landing zones, rendering them defenseless and revealed. Once the snare was triggered, 3 distinct naval groups would close in on Leyte Gulf like a tightening hand. A minor southern group would push through the Surigao Strait, whereas the primary effort, the massive center force, was to traverse the San Bernardino Strait to destroy the landing vessels. It was a strategy that depended on impeccable timing, seamless implementation, and a staggering quantity of fortune. Did its designers genuinely think it could succeed, or were they merely writing a magnificent finale for the Imperial Navy? At the core of this armored punch sat the center force, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. This represented the most formidable surface armada Japan could still assemble.
5 battleships, including the pair of largest ever constructed, Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, and a protective ring of light cruisers and destroyers. This was an armada designed for a heavy-hitting contest, a savage, short-range struggle that Japanese naval theory had romanticized for decades. And to lead this fleet, to function as its mind and its command hub, Kurita required a flagship that was not merely strong, but a demonstrated combat-seasoned survivor. He selected the heavy cruiser Atago. The vessel had served as his command ship for years, a craft that had witnessed almost every significant operation of the conflict. However, as she guided this armada from its docking in Brunei, was she navigating toward a turnaround of luck, or was she merely heading the biggest naval funeral march in recorded history? To comprehend the strike that was imminent, one must initially grasp the nature of the tool. The Atago and her 3 siblings, Takao, Maya, and Chokai, represented the apex of a naval design ideology that was distinctly Japanese. Constructed during the late 1920s within the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, the Takao-class heavy cruisers were a miracle of mechanics and concession, stretching every boundary to the point of failure. They were engineered to be swifter, more durable, and more heavily weaponized than any cruiser their probable American rivals could deploy. Their 10 8-inch cannons, positioned in 5 dual turrets, could discharge a ruinous volley, throwing armor-piercing projectiles more than 20,000 meters. Yet their actual lethality was something much more malevolent. Bordering their decks were swiveling torpedo tubes packed with the most terrifying naval ordnance of the Second World War, the Type 93 torpedo, dubbed the Long Lance by the Allies, who endured terrible losses from its strikes. It was a 30-foot beast of devastating energy. Powered by pure, unstable oxygen rather than compressed air, it traveled with virtually no observable trail, rendering it almost undetectable during its advance. It was quicker, possessed triple the distance, and bore a warhead nearly double the strength of its American equivalent. One solitary long lance could snap a cruiser's spine, and several impacts could sink even the most resilient battleship. These torpedoes served as the great levelers, the quiet killers that personified Japan's emphasis on conclusive nocturnal engagements. With such an instrument available to them, what necessity did a leader have for prudence? However, the most distinguishing characteristic of the Takao class was its profile. While other cruisers possessed low-profile utilitarian bridges, the Takao flaunted a gigantic, looming superstructure that ascended from the deck, resembling a feudal Japanese fortress. This was not for visual appeal, it was a fiercely functional design decision. This 10-story pagoda mast contained everything a fleet leader might require: a reinforced bridge, primary and secondary fire control systems, sophisticated optics and rangefinders, and spacious communications and plotting chambers. It rendered them the ideal stages for managing a complicated naval engagement, true floating bastions from which the flow of combat could be orchestrated. Because of this, the 4 siblings were in perpetual demand, acting as the laborers and flagships for squadrons throughout the combined fleet.
But does focusing so much command capacity in one high-visibility object constitute genuine power or an unacknowledged weakness? Among the 4 sisters, Atago was arguably the most legendary. Commissioned in 1930, she had demonstrated the strength of the Japanese Empire for more than a decade prior to the initial shots at Pearl Harbor. She was present for the rapid conquests of Malaya in the Philippines. She stalked Allied vessels in the Java Sea and protected the carriers during the catastrophe at Midway. She was a pillar of the savage nighttime naval skirmishes surrounding Guadalcanal, outlasting the ferocious point-blank cannon fire of Iron Bottom Sound. She had withstood bombs, near misses, and the relentless wearing down that had dispatched so many other vessels to the ocean floor. Her personnel were proficient, her equipment proven, and the vessel herself appeared to bear an atmosphere of invulnerability. It is little surprise that in the fading light of the Empire, she was selected to spearhead its final frantic assault. After enduring years of vicious combat, had fortune finally transformed into a central element of her protection? Every grand scheme possesses a latent defect, a concealed weak point where the whole complex framework can be made to collapse. Regarding Operation Shogo 1, that defect was a 200-mile span of ocean known as the Palawan Passage. It served as the straightest path for Kurita's center force, a deep-water lane that offered a quick trip toward the Sibuyan Sea and the waiting American invasion troops. Yet this expediency was a deal with the devil. The channel was a geographic choke point, bordered by shoals and the island of Palawan, which drastically restricted a massive fleet's capacity to turn. More significantly, it was a recognized killing field, a location where American submariners hunted with enduring deadliness. U.S. submariners had even bestowed upon it a darkly fitting moniker, Submarine Alley. By selecting this route, was Admiral Kurita placing velocity above the basic safety of his armada. Far below the surface of this corridor, two quiet hunters were on watch. They were the USS Darter and the USS Dace, Gato-class fleet submarines, the laborers of the American Silent Service. These were not the clumsy submersibles of the First World War. They were 300-foot-long metallic predators able to function for months far from their base, filled with sophisticated technology and a lethal load of 24 torpedoes. Existence on board was a lesson in contradictions, extended periods of dull repetition in tight, sweat-drenched, diesel-smelling quarters interrupted by instants of adrenaline-charged fear. Commanding this two-vessel wolfpack was Commander David McClintock, the combative and extremely capable captain of the Darter. He and his crew were a small, secluded society, 100 souls locked inside a metal cylinder, floating in the gloom, anticipating. But what does a predator wait for, if not for the grandest quarry imaginable to drift into their crosshairs? At 01:16 on the morning of October 23rd, the period of anticipation ended. Inside the shadowed radar compartment of the USS Darter, an observer spotted it. A solitary weak mark drawing itself onto the green-black display of the advanced SJ radar. Then a second, and a third. In minutes, the monitor was no longer vacant ocean.
It was a spectral host, a vast array of electronic returns extending for miles. McClintock was called, and as he gazed at the impossible procession moving straight toward them, he comprehended this was no simple supply convoy or a tiny destroyer group. The magnitude, velocity, and orderly arrangement could signify only one reality. He had located the primary force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the supreme reward. He had struck the submariner's lottery. How must it feel to understand that your small 2,000-ton craft is about to confront a fleet displacing over 500,000 tons? McClintock did not waver. The opening shot of what was to be the biggest naval engagement in history was not the boom of a gun, but the quiet, unseen beat of a coded radio transmission shot from Darter's aerial. It sped across the Pacific, warning Admiral Halsey's command post that Kurita's armada was located, its direction and pace calculated. The component of total astonishment, the foundation of the Shogo strategy, had just evaporated into the air. Then the pursuit commenced. The Darter and Dace breached the surface, their potent diesel motors roaring into action, driving them over the swells at a frantic 20 knots. They were now in a frantic contest, a high-velocity surface dash through the obscurity to position themselves ahead of the Japanese armada, to station themselves in an ideal ambush location by the time the sun appeared. Could two solitary submarines actually outpace and cut off a complete battle fleet? For the ensuing 4 hours, a strained, quiet theater played out on the dark ocean. Aboard the Japanese warships, observers narrowed their eyes, staring into the moonless blackness, yet they discerned nothing. The low, shadowed forms of the surfaced American submarines were virtually imperceptible against the skyline. Assured he stayed unnoticed and keen to recover lost time, Admiral Kurita made a critical choice. He commanded his fleet to stop anti-submarine zigzagging patterns. Keeping a direct path would hold his arrangement tighter and deliver him to the San Bernardino Strait more quickly, but it also converted his fleet into a straight row of foreseeable, oblivious marks. Was this a measured gamble born of requirement, or a deadly misjudgment of the foe waiting just beyond the skyline? Within the tight control center of the USS Darter, the mood was charged. Commander McClintock and his squad were a cyclone of concentrated action, their tones quiet and firm. The torpedo data computer buzzed, supplied with a continuous flow of data regarding the enemy's velocity, distance, and direction. McClintock now confronted his own crucial choice. The secure move was to strike from the side, shooting a long-distance volley at the battleships in the middle. However, he selected a route of unbelievable boldness. He would steer the darter through the line of protecting destroyers straight into the center of the arrangement to strike the lead column of heavy cruisers from nearly point-blank distance. It was a maneuver of stunning danger. Detection would signify absolute demise as the initial faint suggestions of sunrise started to color the eastern horizon. McClintock hoisted his periscope. Occupying his view were the incredible pagoda-style superstructures of the Takao-class cruisers, gigantic and haughty. He chose his mark, the lead vessel, the largest outline of the group. He was unaware her name was Atago.
He was unaware she was the flagship. He only understood she was the ideal mark. What occupies a captain's thoughts in the last seconds prior to releasing an assault that will permanently change the direction of a conflict? The instant of reality had come. In the dull pre-dawn illumination of 05:32 a.m., the USS Darter was a wound spring, flawlessly located and unseen. From a distance of merely 980 yards, a submariner's fantasy, a battleship skipper's horror. Commander McClintock's tone sliced through the strain of the conning tower. The command was plain, immediate, and history-altering. Fire! One following another, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes hissed from Darter's front tubes. They were famously undependable munitions, inclined to travel too deep or fail to explode. Yet in this unique instant, they were tools of fate, their bubble wakes streaking white through the murky sea. Without a second's hesitation, McClintock commanded a sharp turn, bringing his rear tubes to aim at the subsequent massive form in the line, the cruiser Takao. 4 additional torpedoes released into the ocean. 10 fish were in the water. 10 opportunities to behead a fleet. How many would be required? On the bridge of the flagship Atago, the mood was one of standard preparedness. Admiral Purita and his team were assembled, drinking morning tea, organizing the day's maneuvers, their thoughts centered on the American carriers they anticipated engaging hours from then. They possessed no alerts, no cautions from lookouts, no sign of the quiet demise that was traversing the last few hundred yards. Suddenly, in a singular, violent moment, their reality was ripped asunder. The initial torpedo impacted Atago's right flank with the violence of a volcanic eruption. It smashed through the unarmored shell beneath the waterline, blowing up in her number 1 boiler chamber. A massive fountain of seawater, oil, and twisted metal burst skyward. Before the blast wave had even dispersed, a second torpedo struck immediately after, right under the looming bridge edifice, eviscerating 2 additional boiler rooms. The gigantic vessel, displacing over 15,000 tons, was hoisted and crashed down by the explosive power, vibrating so savagely that men were tossed from their footing across whole sections. Could anyone, even a veteran admiral, understand such an abrupt disaster? The consequence was immediate and ruinous. The vessel's electrical dynamos were destroyed, casting the hundreds of rooms beneath the deck into total, horrifying gloom. All energy was gone, the illumination, the air circulation, the interior comms, all lifeless. Deep within the ship's depths, the power of the explosions had cut the primary steam pipes, releasing superheated vapor that boiled men to death where they stood. Atago was no longer a combat ship. She was a lifeless, floating wreck, leaning instantly and sharply to the right. Yet the Darter's assault was not concluded. A third torpedo located its target, and subsequently a fourth, tearing into another boiler chamber and the ship's seaplane hangar, sparking a ferocious aviation fuel blaze. 4 solid impacts. It was a nearly flawless volley, a textbook performance of a submarine trap. How can a vessel, even one constructed for conflict, possibly withstand such an impeccably positioned series of fatal injuries? On the swiftly tilting bridge, disorder ruled.
Admiral Kurita, his chief of staff, and the other high-ranking officers found themselves ensnared. The standard exits were impassable, obstructed by rubble or the extreme slant of the deck. The vessel was tipping over so rapidly that the deck was turning into a wall. In the confusing blackness, their sole method of escape was to smash the heavy glass of the bridge's windows. The 59-year-old leader of the most potent surface armada on Earth was compelled to scramble out a shattered viewport and leap, diving into the frigid, oil-clogged waters of the Palawan Passage. He had transitioned from leading a navy to struggling for his own existence in the duration of a few minutes. What tactical reflections could possibly fill a brain devoured by the instinctual urge to live? As Kurita fought in the ocean, the engagement proceeded. The torpedoes fired at Takao located their mark. 2 collisions shook the second cruiser, disabling her engines, locking her rudder hard to the right, and inducing serious flooding. She was terribly injured, removed from the battle before it had even commenced. However, she would endure. Her sister vessel, Maya, would not be as lucky. The USS Dace, captained by Bladen Claggett, had navigated into an ideal shooting location on the fleet's opposing side. At 05:56, he released his own volley of torpedoes. 4 crashed into Maya, 1 hitting a forward ammo storage. The outcome was a magnificent and terrifying secondary blast. The powerful cruiser was ripped in half by an interior explosion that propelled a pillar of flame and fumes thousands of feet into the sky. The flagship of Cruiser Division 4 disappeared in under 5 minutes, carrying with her more than 330 of her personnel. In a clash that hadn't formally begun, how could the casualties already be so overwhelming? For the sailors of the Atago, the finale was mercifully quick. With no electricity for damage control pumps and infernos burning uncontrolled, the tilt to starboard simply continued rising past 20 degrees, then 40, then 60. She was capsizing. The decks turned into a nearly sheer face of steel, and the living crew clambered over the rail, holding on to anything they could before releasing their grip. At 05:53 a.m., merely 21 minutes following the initial torpedo strike, the heavy cruiser Atago, flagship of the center force and veteran of a dozen operations, overturned entirely. Her rear rose into the sky, and she slid beneath the surface, a final whisper of steam signifying her burial. She took with her 360 souls. In under 30 minutes, an invisible foe had drowned 2 heavy cruisers, disabled a third, and removed the head of the fleet's entire leadership hierarchy. This was not a combat engagement, it was a targeted killing. What optimism persisted for an armada that was now, for all practical intents, a headless titan? The sun came up on a vista of total ruin, where a majestic, regimented fleet had sailed just moments earlier. There was now only turmoil and destruction. The murky waters were blemished by gigantic expanding patches of black fuel oil, a glistening multicolored grave for 2 capital ships. The ocean was scattered with debris, shattered boards, sleeping nets, survival rafts, and the floating heads of hundreds of frantic men, their countenances and clothes coated in the noxious-smelling crude. The surviving vessels of the center force dissolved their arrangement, their crews gazing in shocked incredulity at the vacant spots where Atago and Maya had existed.
The quiet, flawlessly implemented trap was finished. However, the horror for the survivors was only commencing. In these initial instants of trauma, who was genuinely in charge of this leaderless navy? The destroyers of the protective ring, which had been so sadly ignorant of the submarine danger, now leaped into a different type of activity: search and rescue. The destroyer Kishinami dashed toward the final recorded location of the Atago, her sailors frantically tossing lines, meshes, and anything buoyant over the rail. Their main objective was to locate one individual. Shortly, they hauled a cluster of drained, oil-drenched officers from the sea. Among them was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. The 59-year-old leader was pulled onto the deck of the destroyer, a figure who just half an hour prior ruled a powerful armada from a reinforced bridge, now a traumatized and trembling survivor. From the banister of the Kishinami, he was compelled to observe the final moments of his flagship as her stern slid beneath the ripples. How does a leader's mindset alter when he owes his survival not to his own power, but to the valiant actions of an ordinary seaman on a lifeline? The strategic scenario had degraded into a debilitating stagnation. For the subsequent several hours, the center force was a physique lacking a mind. Admiral Kurita was marooned aboard a tiny destroyer, a craft possessing none of the long-distance communication gear, mapping tables, or specialized team needed to lead a complicated naval maneuver. Essential commands had to be passed by rudimentary signal lights and flag hoists, a sluggish and ineffective method that was entirely insufficient for the job at hand. The whole fleet was compelled to decelerate, its attacking drive thoroughly ruined, its attention now directed inward to recovery, damage evaluation, and the frantic hunt for direction. Was this forfeiture of time and impulse in the starting hours of a time-critical scheme an even bigger injury than the destruction of the vessels themselves? Finally, Kurita took the only rational choice accessible. He would shift his flag to the strongest vessel left, the super battleship Yamato. Yet even this was a slow and dangerous procedure. The Yamato had to stop, dropping a launch to transport the admiral and his team across the rough, junk-strewn ocean. Throughout this, the danger of another submarine strike hung heavily in the atmosphere. The assurance of the entire armada had been shattered. The mirage of their own power and the security of their arrangement was vanished, substituted by the horrifying realization that a quiet, unseeable foe could be anywhere, poised to attack again. Regarding Admiral Kurita personally, the event of being torpedoed, swimming for survival, and watching his authority crumble must have inflicted a deep mental wound. Is it feasible for any chieftain to formulate cold, measured tactical choices when they have just withstood such an intensely personal and harrowing experience? Concurrently, the predators were about to confront their own abrupt overturn of luck. Excited with victory, the USS Darter and USS Dace were not finished. They started to hunt the damaged cruiser Takao, which was sluggishly hobbling away, wishing to finish her off. In the intensity of the pursuit, tragedy occurred. Steering through the dangerous, inadequately mapped seas of the Palawan Passage, both vessels slammed firmly onto the Bombay Shoal, a sunken reef.
The Dace managed to wrench herself loose, but the Darter was wedged tight, her hull sheets creaking and ripping. Commander McClintock, the figure who had directed one of the most triumphant submarine assaults in history, was now compelled to issue the command to desert his own vessel. The whole complement of the Darter was moved to the Dace, which then tried to sink the stuck submarine with her own torpedoes and cannon fire to stop it from falling into adversary hands. In a concluding sour twist, the Mark 14 torpedoes, which had functioned so flawlessly against the Japanese, neglected to explode against the unmoving hull of their own submarine. Why does the machinery of conflict so frequently appear to hold a vicious and erratic sense of irony? The Dace, now hazardously packed with the personnel of 2 submarines, was compelled to retreat, leaving the ruin of the Darter behind, a peculiar shrine to a magnificent triumph and a humiliating conclusion. The submarine's input, however, was already inscribed into the tale of the engagement. The trap in Submarine Alley had achieved more than merely destroying ships. It had fundamentally changed the starting terms of the conflict. It had slowed the center force, cast its leadership into confusion, and planted grains of prudence and worry into the psyche of its leader. The initial play of the battle had been a shocking American win, gained at the price of 1 submarine running aground. Yet as the sun rose higher, Kurita's fleet, now punished and rattled, steamed forward. Their trial was only just starting. What additional terrors awaited them in the waves of the Sibuyan Sea, in the immense violent tallying of the Battle of Leyte Gulf? The destruction of the heavy cruiser Atago is frequently eclipsed by the more catastrophic destiny of a bigger vessel. The ensuing day, her sister ship, the super battleship Musashi, would be mobbed by hundreds of American carrier planes in the Sibuyan Sea.
In a demonstration of engineering rage that shocked the globe, the biggest battleship ever destroyed by air power would soak up an unbelievable 19 torpedoes and 17 direct bomb impacts before she finally yielded. That legendary contest, the unmovable object versus the unstoppable force, often grabs the fantasy. However, the sinking of the Atago in the still gray sunrise of the previous day was arguably the more conclusive hit. It was not a war of attrition, it was a strategic assassination. Why is the destruction of a command hub sometimes more ruinous than the destruction of the most potent stronghold? The sinking of the Atago was a harsh tutorial in the advancement of naval combat. For ages, the height of naval warfare was the duel between grand vessels, their strength quantified in the mass of their broadside and the density of their shielding. The Takao-class cruisers were the personification of this ideology, drifting castles engineered to outduel their peers. Yet Atago was annihilated by a foe she never spotted, by an instrument that moved invisibly under the swells, directed by the phantom-like beats of radar. Her end, and that of the Maya, was evidence that the era of the surface giant was closing. The real rulers of the ocean were no longer the boats with the largest cannons, but those that dominated the realms above and beneath the water.
A solitary, well-aimed torpedo from a submarine or a single bomb from an airplane could now nullify all the plating and weaponry a warship held. Was this solitary assault the instant the Imperial Japanese Navy's theory, so centered on the conclusive surface clash, was demonstrated to be lethally outdated? The most deep-seated effect, however, was psychological, and it focused on one individual, Admiral Takeo Kurita. The bodily and psychic trauma of the trap cannot be exaggerated. His flagship was annihilated from beneath him. He was cast into the ocean, and his armada was cast into disorder. This occurrence sowed a germ of entrenched wariness. For the remainder of the engagement, Kurita would be stalked by the ghost of the unseeable foe. He became progressively and perhaps reasonably suspicious of intelligence updates, continually dreading another trap, another ruinous surprise assault from the sky or from the depths. This grain of uncertainty would yield its most debatable harvest 2 days later at the peak of the whole mission. After miraculously steering through the San Bernardino Strait and descending upon a tiny petrified cluster of American escort carriers codenamed Taffy 3, Kurita was on the edge of the very triumph Shogo was intended to secure. He held the American landing force in the palm of his hand.